Hello chess fans, this is Rick from Chess to Impress with the last video of 2017, and it is on the 2017 Russian Championships played in December 2017. Won by Peter Svidler for the 8th time. The great Peter Svidler from St. Petersburg is Russian champion. It was not the strongest Russian championship in history. For example, players like Karyakin and Kramnik did not take part, but of course a Russian championship is always very strong, because there are so many strong players in that huge country. After the regular tournament, Peter Svidler ended in joint first place with Nikita Vitigov, and they had to play a rapid tiebreak. And this is the first game from the tiebreak. Vitigov was white, Svidler was black, played on the 14th of December 2017, and the time control was 15 minutes for the whole game, plus a 10-second increment per move. It was played on the same day as the last round. The 11th round was played. For this video I've taken the comments from the Grandmasters Morozevich and Miroshnichenko from the live broadcast, and Vitigov played d4 on the first move, knight f6 from Svidler, and bishop g5, and this came as a surprise for Svidler, who spent some time here. In a rapid game on the second move he already spent quite a bit of time. Came up with e6, knight d2, h6 kicking the bishop, bishop h4, and d5 from Svidler. e3, c5, we have a sort of a reverse Queen's Gambit, and it also has similarities with the solid London system. c3, knight bd7, and here you can play f4. That was a move that was looked at by those two grandmasters in a live broadcast, or knight gf3. And in the end, Vitigov decided on bishop d3. But now Svidler can play e5, which he could not have played if Vitigov would have played f4 or knight gf3. Knight e2 from Vitigov, allowing the pawn to be pushed to e4, which would give the game a French structure with reversed colors, and Vitigov plays the French with black, so he wouldn't mind playing a position like that with the white pieces. Svidler decided not to push the pawn, and he played bishop e7. Both players castled, bishop g3, and that is putting pressure on the e5 pawn. Svidler decides to solve the problem by taking on d4, e takes d4, and rook e8. And this position still has some resemblance with the French defense with colors reversed, as was pointed out by Morozevich and Miroshnichenko in the live broadcast. D takes d5 from Vitigov to clarify the structure, as the Grandmaster said. Knight takes c5 and bishop b5. Vitigov does not want to give black the two bishops, which black threatened to take on d3. Bishop d7 from Svidler. Those bishops were swapped, and now white's knights are not positioned very well. Black is already quite comfortable here, and the two grandmasters started to discuss if black was maybe even a bit better after only 14 moves. Knight d4, improving his knight. Knight fe4 from Svidler, and knight to f3, improving that knight. Bishop f6, knight b3, and here the grandmasters predicted Svidler's move. Knight a4 came with some annoying pressure against b2. Vitigov protected b2 with the queen, and now rook a c8, and there's a lot of pressure on c3 from the knight, from the bishop, and from the rook. In some variations, sacrifices on c3 are possible, and we'll see one later. Rook a d1 and b5. Now b4 would be very strong, and Vitigov is not allowing it. He plays a3. Svidler took on g3, which was criticized by the two grandmasters in the live broadcast, as knight e4, the knight on e4 was such a great piece. h takes d3, and now a possible move, and I'm sure Svidler looked at it, was bishop takes d3. There we have that sacrifice. And after b takes, knight takes, we're attacking the rook, and we have a discovered attack on the queen. The best move here is queen d2, and after knight takes, rook takes, black has rook and 2 pawns for 2 knights, and the position is about equal. So that is a perfectly viable option to sacrifice on c3, but Svidler decided against it and played knight b6. He's going to reroute his knight. Knight bd4, knight c4, and knight e2. On its way to f4 to put pressure on the weak d5 pawn. Black has a tremendous knight on c4, but a weak pawn on d5. Queen b7 from Svidler. And there comes knight f4. And rook cd8 to protect that pawn a second time. On those last 2 moves, queen b7 and rook cd8, Svidler spent about half of the 9 minutes he had. The position is about equal. Knight h5 from Vitigov. Now that the black queen has left the king side, white brings his pieces to the king side. It's quite interesting to hear how grandmasters think, because this move was expected by Morozevich and Miroshnichenko. Bishop e7, knight d4, g6 kicking the knight, and knight f4. And there's always knight takes g6 sacrifices in the air, and we'll see a few of them. For just a second, the 2 grandmasters in the studio looked at this sacrifice, knight e6, and then if you take that knight, there is queen takes g6, check, king h8, and checkmate. That looks very dangerous. So after knight e6, you should not take that knight. You should take the other knight. G takes h5, and then white can take the rook, and rook takes d8. It's a possible variation, but Vitigov decided not to go for it. As said, after g6, he played knight f4. Bishop f6. Bishop went back to that active square, and if you now sacrifice on g6, there is f takes, queen takes, and the black queen comes into the defense. That is not a good sacrifice for whites. But black constantly has to calculate those knight sacrifices. Rook fe1 was played by Vitigov, and here playing a natural move like king g7 is a blunder because of knight de6 check, which is very good for white. It's a fork, and if you take, the other knight comes to e6, and white gets a good position. So after rook fe1, Svidler has to be careful. He played rook e4, good move, knight f3, and a5. Here the 2 grandmasters in the live broadcast looked at a cheapo. They suggested king h2, and if you then play a4, then suddenly there is knight takes d5, and your rook is hanging, and you cannot take on e1 in between because there is knight takes f6 check, king g7, rook takes d8, and this is winning for white. Nice variation. But after a5, Vitigov did not play king h2, he played knight d2, hitting the rook. A pair of rooks was swapped, and b4, Morozevich called this a very direct approach. Another option would have been d4 to try and get this bishop to become more active. After the move from the game, b4, Vitigov took on b4. The grandmasters looked at a other variation, at knight takes c4, and that is actually quite good for white. D takes c4, c takes b4, a takes b4, queen takes c4, and then after b takes a3, b takes a3, white is a pawn up, and the pawn on g6 is hanging. because of this pin. So Morozevich asked the question, why didn't White not go for this? And Miroshnichenko gave the simple answer, well, because it's a rapid game and both players only had a few minutes here. The position is still equal. Black has enough compensation for the pawn, but this is a safe way to play for White. So all this was after b4, the move in the game, and then knight takes c4. But Vitigov played a takes b4. Svidler took back, and only now did he play knight takes c4, d takes, and c takes b4. A radical way to make a draw instead of c takes b4 is knight takes g6. All this was seen immediately by the grandmasters in the broadcast. It's a sacrifice, f takes g6, queen takes, queen interposes, and then rook e8 check is the move. Rook takes, queen takes, king h7, queen e4 check, queen g6, and the c4 pawn goes. And this should be an easy draw. White has enough pawns and compensation for the bishop, and also very important is that this bishop is of the dark colors and the promotion square for the pawn is a light square. So even if White loses everything and Black is stuck with bishop and the h-pawn, the position is still a draw. Back to the game after d takes c4, instead of this knight takes g6 move, Vitigov played c takes b4. Queen takes and rook c1, and it was clear to the grandmasters that White is trying to make a draw here. Rook d4, Svidler shows that he still wants to play. He could have taken on b2 instead, and then queen takes c4 works because rook d1 check is not a problem. Of course you cannot take the rook because then your queen is hanging, but White can just play king h2 and this position is about equal. But rook d4 was played by Svidler and queen e2 from Vitigov, and again White could have gone for a sacrifice here instead with knight takes g6, f takes, queen takes, bishop g7, queen e6 check, king h8, queen c8 check, queen f8, and rook takes c4 with a draw similar to the variation we saw earlier. And again this was seen in just a couple of seconds by the two grandmasters in the broadcast. Quite incredible. But White's position is not so bad that he has to look for a sacrifice, and after rook d4, as said, Vitigov played queen e2. He did not go for that sacrifice. King g7, logical move from Svidler, taking those sacrifices out of the position. Rook c2 and h5. White is passive, but he should have enough to hold this position to a draw. King h2 and h4 by Svidler. You cannot take that pawn, of course, because your knight will be hanging. After h4, Vitigov played queen f3. And here Svidler decided to take on g3 with check. And very instructive, here White took back with the f-pawn, which was very logical according to the grandmasters. The idea is to play rook f2, as we'll see in the game, to get some counterplay over the f-file. After queen takes d3 instead, then there is queen b5 to stop the knight h5 move, which was a threat after taking with the queen. And then the grandmasters were talking about unpleasant pins. So they were probably mentioning a bishop ending up here, and then there's lots of pins on that diagonal. So taking with the pawn made perfect sense, getting that counterplay over the f-file. Queen d6 from Svidler, there goes the rook to f2, and queen e5. Morozevich called this a solid pass move. Rook e2 hitting the queen, and the queen went to f5. Both players had about 20 seconds here with a 10-second increment per move. Rook back to f2, bishop e5 improving his bishop, queen e3, queen e4, and now played with 2 seconds on the clock, the blunder knight h5. Actually, Morozevich for a second suggested that move, but then said straight away that black does not have the d8 square, and we'll see in a minute what he meant by that. What Vidygov could have played, instead of knight h5 check, which was a blunder, he could have taken the queen, rook takes, rook c2, and then, for example, just to show you a variation, bishop takes f4, g takes, rook takes, and king g3, and this game should end in a draw, even though black is a pawn up. But under the pressure of the clock, Vidygov lashed out with knight h5 check. He only had 2 seconds, as I said, when he made that move, and it's a mistake. Svidler didn't hesitate, took the knight, and queen g5 was played, queen g5 check. But after king f8, both grandmasters said, well, what is the point of the sacrifice? And indeed, if white would have the d8 square, then queen d8 would set up a perpetual check. But that d8 square is covered by black's rook. So the sacrifice does not make sense. Here white could have taken on h5, but then black swaps the queens with queen h4 check, using the pin of the g3 pawn. Queen takes, rook takes, and black has a winning endgame. So Vidygov did not take on h5, he played one last check, but after king e8 he had to resign. He's just a piece down. In the second tiebreak game, Vidygov had to win with black, but he got nowhere near that, and shortly after the opening he had already got into such a mess that he resigned, and Peter Svidler was champion of Russia for the 8th time in his life. Quite remarkable. 2 nice tweets after the tiebreak, one from the new champion himself. Wow, I'd have given very long odds against that happening midway through. Off to celebrate, thanks for all the support and kind words. And a tweet from Peter Heine Nielsen, Magnus Carlsen's second. He said, the Russian chess championship is played by 12 players, and in the end, Peter Svidler always wins. Hope you enjoyed this video on Peter the 8th, Peter the Great. If you did, please give the video a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the Chess to Impress channel. Please leave a comment, and if you liked the video, it would be great if you could share it on social media. You also may want to check out my Chess to Progress channel. The link is in the description box. And I want to wish you a very happy 2018. This is the last video of 2017. In 2018 I hope to make many more videos for you. It will be an exciting chess year, with first the candidates tournament in Berlin, and then later at the end of the year the match of the World Championship, Magnus Carlsen against the winner of the candidates tournament in London. This is Rick for Chess to Impress. Thank you for watching.